from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. When Jesus spoke about the things that would happen before he returns, he spoke of terrifying things that have come true in terrifying ways. He said that not one stone of that temple would be left upon another. Within just a few decades of when he spoke those words, there was a Jewish uprising. The Roman legions were sent to quell that uprising and retake that territory. They inflicted devastating losses upon the Jewish people. The survivors of that rebellion took refuge in the city of Jerusalem, and General Pompey and his Roman legions surrounded the city, and they built a wall around the city. They built a wall around the wall of the city so that nobody could get away. And nobody could get in to bring any food or water. They were going to starve the city to death. By a particular act of cruelty, actually, they did allow some to enter the city. Around the Passover time, they allowed all of the people around who wanted to come to Jerusalem to worship, they allowed them to enter the city for the Passover, but of course they didn't let them leave again. More people, more mouths to eat all the food. When the city had sufficiently starved and enough had died and the rest were weak, the Roman legions broke through the outer defenses and they slaughtered men, women, and children. The temple they destroyed. They burned the gold off of the walls, off of the pillars, and not one stone left on another. You would have seen it and said, Jesus told us the truth. He saw that this would happen. There was a little bit that remained, a portion of the western wall. It's known as the Wailing Wall today, but that's it. The holy articles that were used in the temple worship, the golden lampstand, the table where they kept the showbread, all of these things that they used to worship the Lord, they were taken off as plunder, paraded around in Rome as part of their triumphal entry, celebrating their victory. Jesus spoke of other wars too. The world has seen no shortage of wars, and we might just think of the ones that have happened in our experience and in our history. We don't remember it, but you still think about it's just a terrible civil war in our country, and brother against brother, and certainly some awful amount of bloodshed. A little bit more recently, the world wars. We might think of the Holocaust, just the horrors that we heard of, probably more that we didn't hear about. A little bit more recently, probably a little too recent yet, a little too fresh on our minds for some of us, Korea, Vietnam. In my lifetime, I think about Iraq and Afghanistan and 9/11. With it being Veterans Day, this past week, I think about how our veterans could probably tell us some pretty horrifying stories of things that they saw, things that were done, the wars that were fought. But the thing is, most of the time they don't tell those stories. If they do, if our veterans want to talk about the things that they've lived through, we owe it to them to listen, to at least understand and appreciate the price of our peace. But most of the time they don't want to tell those stories. They say things like, why would you want to hear about that? And I wonder if maybe are they still protecting us from the things we shouldn't have to hear about? They fought so that we wouldn't have to experience those things. Jesus spoke of pestilence Again, another thing that's a little too fresh on our minds yet, COVID was pretty bad. Not too fun. But there have even been worse things in the history of the world, and maybe even in your history. You might think of polio or some flu epidemics. A lot of people died. Or you might remember hearing about smallpox, 500 million people dying. You might remember hearing about how the plague killed half of Europe in like 5 years. Jesus said things like that would happen before he comes back. He talked about earthquakes, natural disasters, terrifying things that we would hear about. Every year there's fires in California and hurricanes on our East Coast. And when you start going to look for, when you start looking into those stories, it's scary to think about the things that could happen. The things that usually don't happen to you, but could. Tornadoes, the things that have happened to other people. In 1903, an earthquake that registered 7.8 on the Richter scale destroyed 80% of San Francisco. The things that could happen are terrifying. Jesus spoke of fearful events. Maybe another thing still too fresh on your mind. Last year in Waukesha, an SUV crashes through the Christmas parade. Do you think twice before you go out in public when you hear about things like that? Since I mentioned veterans, I'd also like to mention anybody else along with veterans who knows what it really means to risk your life for other people, police officers and firefighters. You know better than most that you can't save us from this world and the things that could happen. The very best that you can do is try to push off that disaster until tomorrow, or try to be there for us when it happens. But the world isn't going to get any better. Jesus said all these things would happen and that it would get worse. We thank God for the people that risk their lives to be there for us when that disaster strikes, the people that risk their lives to put off that disaster until tomorrow. But the devil intends to use all of those things to terrify you. He wants you to turn in anger against God, a God who allows these things to happen, a God who rules over this world and said these things would happen, the God who said that these things would happen and that it would be sort of a rumbling of his judgment, worse things coming upon the people of this world because of the evil committed against the Lord and against each other, because of our sins. There's another thing that Jesus said has come true and will always come true. He said that we would bear testimony about him. Because there will be those times when it's not just the disasters, it's not just the earthquakes and the fires and the wars and all that stuff, but even as all of that stuff is happening, even worse than that, there would be people that turn against us. He said that parents would betray their children. Brothers and sisters would betray each other, and everybody would be against you. Everybody would hate you because of him. Because of the way that the world has decided they hate Jesus. The world has turned against God and sinned against him, and they see Jesus in us. Everyone will hate you because of me, Jesus said. And so you will testify about me. That has come true too. That we would be this little light of truth in a dark and evil world, and this little light of truth would not be extinguished. However much the devil would try to turn you against God so that you would be punished with him, however much the world would hate you because it hates Jesus, even if the devil succeeds in turning your family members against Jesus and turning them against you too, this little light of truth, your faith, won't be extinguished. Jesus promised that. He told you, don't worry beforehand about what you will say, because he will be with you. And he will give you the words and the wisdom and the courage to say it, so that you will stand with him. He said, not one hair on your head will perish. You know, Christians have been killed for this faith, right? I guess it could happen to us, but I don't think so. It doesn't look likely, but you never know. The world can be that evil. The devil certainly can be that evil. Could happen. But even if it does, not one hair on your head will perish. You know what that means. It means that Jesus has you in his hands. He will protect you from every danger. And even if it happens that a hurricane takes your life, or even if it happens that the sinful world, which hates Christ, hates you, even if they put you to death, you will not die. Not one hair on your head will be lost. He will raise your bodies from the grave when he comes back. All these rumblings of his judgment, these signs of his return, the wars and the disasters and the people who hate him, all these rumblings of his return, it also means that he's coming back for you, to save you. He paid for you with his blood. He washed you clean, and he will raise even your body from the grave, and not one hair of your head will perish. You know what that makes me think of? You probably think of it too. That story about the three men in the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, long ago, these three men in Babylon, just these three believers. They were officials in the king's court, and the king had made a decree. He made a statute and a command that everybody needed to bow down and pray to the statue when the music played. And the music played, and everybody bowed down and prayed to the statue. And these three men in the king's court, probably standing right next to the king up on the stage, they didn't bow down. Can you imagine the crowd all bowing to the statue, and these three guys sticking out like three sore thumbs, standing up for Jesus? They didn't know him as Jesus yet, but they knew him, the God who saves us, the only God who is. They believed that he would come for them, that he could protect them from the fire, and that he would come for them. And that even if they died, even if they got thrown into that furnace, because that was, the punishment, the king's decree. If you don't bow down to the golden statue, you get thrown in the fire. And they knew God is able to save us from the fire. They even told the king, right? Do you remember that part? The king has them hauled into court. He puts them on trial. Everybody's watching. Why did you do that? And they said, the God we serve is able to save us from the fire. And even if he doesn't, we will not bow down to your statue. They stood with Jesus. And they were thrown into the fire. The king was enraged. The sinful world that hates Jesus will hate us because they see him in us. The king was enraged. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The guards who threw the men in died on the spot. It was so hot. And these 3 men thrown into the furnace, they started walking around because Jesus joined them in the fire. He was there. They saw 4 men, not 3. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Jesus walking around with them in the fire. The king finally had to tell them to come back out again. And when they did, he saw that not one hair on their head was burned. Not even their eyebrows. They didn't even smell like smoke. And Jesus said, that will be you. That you shouldn't be afraid of what's going to happen. He's keeping you safe. You shouldn't worry about how you're going to handle the situations or what you're going to say, because he will be with you, and he will give you words, and he will give you the courage. And when you stand with him, you will not be lost. Not one hair on your head, even if they kill you, not one hair on your head will perish. Amen. Please stand.